To understand the import and the stakes of what happened on Capitol Hill today, and to understand how it shows us exactly how Donald Trump, in a second term as president, has given up on even pretending to want to govern. We begin with a moment from exactly 8 years ago. Here's a snippet from the confirmation hearing of Donald Trump's first defense secretary, General Jim Mattis.
I'll join my colleagues in thanking you for your service. You've spent your entire life in service of the country, keeping it safe. And we all know the most important function of federal government is to keep its citizens safe at all times. And you've done that with honor and with integrity. So thank you on behalf of a grateful nation.
If you end up in this job, our national security may well depend in part on your willingness to voice your opinions, even when others disagree, even when you are under pressure to remain silent. We are counting on you.
I believe that your appreciation for the costs of war in blood, treasure, and lives, and the impact on veterans afterward, will enable you to be a check on rash and potentially ill-considered use of military force by a president-elect who perhaps lacks that same appreciation. And so I think you will have a critical role as Secretary of Defense in providing a check on that kind of action.
So all those comments made to Jim Mattis. Jim Mattis would go on to be confirmed by the United States Senate 98-1, a celebrated and politically uncontroversial pick by any ideological standard. Donald Trump at the time was proud to stand with him and to have nominated him. He made the announcement to great fanfare at a rally in December 2016.
One of our great, great generals. We are going to appoint Mad Dog Mattis as our Secretary of Defense. Mad Dog. He's great. He is great. I asked one of the generals, I love the generals, and I won't use his name, but he probably would come forward. But I said to him, "You're a good general, aren't you?" "Yes, sir, I am." I said, "So how do you compare to General Mattis? How do you compare to Mad Dog?" "Sir, he's better than I am."
The caliber, the character, the reputation of General Jim Mattis mattered to Trump, and you heard the crowd roar. Important to know where we've been to understand where we are. Vital context for what happened today at the confirmation hearing for a very different person, a man named Pete Hegseth, who went before the Senate Armed Services Committee today. Fox News Weekend host Pete Hegseth, to put it mildly, is no Jim Mattis. No, not even by Trump standards. If anything, the through line of Trump's picks to lead the Pentagon, from General Jim Mattis to Mark Esper to Pete Hegseth, represents and perfectly encapsulates the complete erosion of standards that, ironically, Pete Hegseth likes to complain about. Except Hegseth attributes an erosion of standards to women. Women who serve their country with honor, women who go toe-to-toe with any man serving in the U.S. military. Here's Senator Tim Kaine questioning Pete Hegseth on his past.
You cheated on the mother of that child less than 2 months after that daughter was born, didn't you?
Those were false charges. Well, no, fully investigated, and I was completely cleared. And I am so grateful for the marriage I have to this amazing woman behind me.
You've admitted that you had sex at that hotel in October 2017. You said it was consensual. Isn't that correct?
Anything?
You've admitted that it was consensual, and you were still married, and you just had a child by another woman.
Again,
how do you explain your judgment?
Completely false charges against me.
You
fully investigated, and I was completely cleared.
We'll stop here for a second. Now, here are the facts. Prosecutors declined to charge Pete Hegseth with rape after Monterey police investigated an accusation that he had raped a woman while at a conference in 2017. The fact pattern is not the same thing as what Pete Hegseth says there. Here's more from Senator Tim Kaine's questioning of him.
The incident in Monterey led to a criminal charge, a criminal investigation, a private settlement, and a cash payment to the woman who filed the complaint. And there was also a non-disclosure agreement, correct?
It was a confidential settlement agreement off of a nuisance lawsuit.
Right. During an interview, you claimed that you settled the matter because you were worried that if it became public, it might hurt your career. Do you maintain that you were blackmailed?
Senator, I maintain that false claims were made against me.
But you didn't reveal any of this to President Trump or the transition team as they were considering you to be nominated for Secretary of Defense. You didn't reveal the action. You didn't reveal the criminal complaint. You didn't reveal the criminal investigation. You didn't reveal the settlement. You didn't reveal the cash payment. Why didn't you inform the commander-in-chief and the transition team of this very relevant event?
Senator, I've appreciated every part of the process with the transition team. They have been open and honest with me. We've had great conversations between the two of us. And I appreciate the opportunity that President-elect Trump has given me.
You chose not to reveal this, right? Because you knew it would hurt your chances. So you chose not to reveal this really important thing to the commander-in-chief and the transition team because you were worried about your chances rather than trying to be candid with the future president of the United States. Many of your work colleagues have said that you show up for work under the influence of alcohol or drunk. I know you've denied that, but you would agree with me, right, that if that was the case, that would be disqualifying for somebody to be Secretary of Defense.
Senator, those are all anonymous false claims, and the totality
they're not anonymous.
The letters on the record here.
They're not anonymous.
On the record, people
we've seen records with names
Vets
attached
for Freedom,
to them.
Concerned Vets for America, and Fox News attributing to me being working hard every day on behalf.
One of your colleagues said that you got drunk at an event at a bar and chanted, "Kill all Muslims." Another colleague, not anonymous, we have this, said that you took co-workers to a strip club. You were drunk, you tried to dance with strippers, you had to be held off the stage, and one of your employees in that event filed a sexual harassment charge as a result of it. Now, I know you denied these things, but isn't that the kind of behavior that, if true, would be disqualifying for somebody to be Secretary of Defense?
Again, elections have consequences. Trump won this one. This isn't about the election, right? This is about the distance Donald Trump has traveled from General Jim Mattis to that guy whose smirk does all the talking. Now, Trump's nominee to be defense secretary was confronted by questions of character and fitness, but they were posed by only one of the country's two political parties. And that is where we start today with some of our favorite reporters and friends. NBC News Capitol Hill correspondent Ryan Nobles is here. Also joining us, former Democratic Senator and MSNBC political analyst Claire McCaskill is here. With me at the table, former Republican Congressman, MSNBC political analyst David Jolly is here. And the host of the Independent Americans podcast, founder and CEO of Independent Veterans of America, Paul Rieckhoff, joins us as well. Paul, what did active duty military think of Jim Mattis?
He was a god. I mean, they called him Saint Mattis. There were shrines to Mattis in Marine Corps barracks all around the world. And he was held up, as our generation's Patton in many ways, in part because he embodied the ethos and the values of the military: loyalty, duty, respect, selfless service, honor, integrity, personal courage. We all know them. And Mattis embodied all that. What you saw today is someone who violates all those values. And I think what you saw today is the first major battle in Trump's culture war. And that's a culture war. We've talked about it over the last couple of months. Pete Hegseth is an effective culture warrior, and he brought that war to this confirmation hearing today. And we didn't talk about Iran or about nuke policy or about, carrier strike groups. We talked about whether or not he can be trusted to get drunk on the job or not, and whether or not he lied to his family and to potentially to Trump. And I think this is a new low. This is our new normal. But I also think the Democrats failed to score any knockout blows. They beat him up a little bit. Kaine was effective. Gillibrand was effective. But a lot of it missed. And right now, Hegseth is in good standing. But we've got a couple days left. And I think in 2025, we have to be ready for anything to come out, because the FBI report was not comprehensive. Didn't talk to his two ex-wives, didn't talk to his accuser. And I think now comes that moment where there's kind of a race between the vote and whether or not anything else or anyone else will come out.
Is it sustainable, though, to have only one party care?
No. No, and this is the most important position, in my view, in the cabinet. And that's why Trump is leading with it. He knows that if he can take the Pentagon and he can shift culture there and he can block the guardrails and put his loyalists in, then everything else becomes easy. So it's obviously a defining point for the Republicans and for the Democrats. But I think for kind of 2 years, we've been holding our breath on both of them, and both of them have failed. So this is a true crisis for our democracy and most urgently for our national security.
I mean, because I take your point about the performance of the Democrats today, but our system isn't set up for only the Democratic Party to care about who leads the United States military.
I agree. But who are we holding out hope for here? I mean, Markwayne Mullin's not going to be the guy. Tom Cotton's not going to be the person. I do think that there's still a chance that Joni Ernst and Murkowski and Collins are keeping their powder dry. They're waiting to see if someone will come forward, if someone will come out publicly. I almost thought Kaine was going to present something after that. It felt like he was leading up to something new, but they don't have anything new. But I do think that Hegseth was also in part chosen to set the tone. Trump wants to show that he's going to try to run the table. He's going to push the Democrats. He's going to own the narrative. And on this battle, at least, I think the Democrats have lost.
I walked through the perfect storm of stories around these three different social media platforms, Zuckerberg running both Facebook and Instagram. And there's technology there, but it seems now to be much more than a tech story. It seems to affect information and democracy. Your thoughts on what we just laid out above?
Look, you connected some pretty big dots here that run the gamut of the ultimate suppression of information, the elevation of conspiracy and mis and disinformation, and more importantly, mainstreaming it in such a way that, as you noted at various points in your lead, it's hard to tell. People can't tell necessarily what the storyline is, what the truth is. And Zuckerberg himself, was fancily talking about, we're sitting here, we're looking at this, and we're seeing that people can't necessarily see or hear or understand this a certain way or a different way. So we're just going to take out the guardrails and just let them interpret for themselves. Let's redefine what facts are. So, yeah, this is a setup for the second term. It has been part of a series of narratives and storylines along the way. Steve Bannon has largely been orchestrating it. It's a little bit laughable to kind of watch the dance between him and Elon Musk right now, which has been going on for quite some time, because Steve, game recognizes game, baby. All right? He knows exactly what Elon was up to. It's like, wait a minute, you gonna move in on my turf? You gonna move on my ground? That's why he's suddenly such an evil person. Now, if he just stayed in his lane and just, continued to use his money and authority that he has to benefit Donald Trump, while all the other, players got to do their thing, that's a different story. But yeah, these three pieces do connect in a way that I think is very telling about how this incoming second term for Trump is likely to play out. It's not just the bending of the knee by Bezos and Musk and others. And it's about what they do once they bend the knee. And that's the part that comes next.
Yeah, I think that's well put. And the difference between journalism, which has plenty of criticism and some of it's valid, and these businesses is that the businesses never said they were trying to do fact-checking anyway. Right. I mean, take even an outlet that people might not like. Think of your outlet you don't like. If it's a reputable outlet, it would never announce we're not fact-checking anymore. It wouldn't even make sense, right. Where some of these businesses can do that. While I have you to start the week, and I reminded viewers, Michael, that inauguration's now 1 week away, and everyone can kind of shake off a few things and cobwebs and begin anew. Hopefully people got some rest or replenishment. We like to look at it big, and I wanted to get your view on the larger picture of how America looks in the mirror and where we go in the weeks ahead. Teeing off the culture, where we heard from Jeff Daniels, whom people know from all kinds of work, but he's been in a bunch of political films, as some folks might know. And we just heard from him. I just had him on the program on one of my series, and he said something really interesting. I want to play for your reaction on the other side.
Yeah, they've won for now. I mean, I've always said November 5th we're going to find out who we are. And we did. But maybe it's if you want to have some hope, maybe it's who we are now.
Michael?
I agree with that. I've been saying it for 2 cycles, 3 cycles now. We are who we are. We are where we are because this is where we want to be. America doesn't move itself into the throes of MAGA and Trumpism unless it wants to be there. You don't make yourself into that space unless there's an underlying thread that you are pulling that pulls you closer or more into it. So I think Jeff is exactly right about that analysis. I'm a little bit skeptical about the other side of it, that, for now, the question is how long is for now? And we'll see. I can tell you this, 1 week from this hour, America will already begin to look and feel very differently because the executive orders that will be implemented at 12:01 p.m. That day will begin to set in motion a different reality for a lot of people who think this is where they want to be. And that will then answer both my and Jeff's point about where we are and who we are, because our response to those executive actions, our response to this leveling up of authoritarianism, in whatever form, meek and mild it may first appear, will tell us a lot about what America looks like 2 Mondays from now.
All of this is meant to create a reconciliation vehicle in which every single priority of the Republicans can be put into one bill and passed. I think they're banking on this by a 2 or 3 vote party line margin. What's your plan to stop that?
We're willing as House Democrats to find bipartisan common ground with the incoming administration and our Republican colleagues on any issue whenever and wherever possible in order to make life better for the American people, particularly as it relates to driving down the high cost of living. But at the same period of time, it appears that our Republican colleagues aren't really serious about lowering housing costs. They're not serious about lowering child care costs. They certainly are not serious about lowering health care costs or bringing down the cost of groceries. We've not seen a single plan since the election. What they do want to do, Chris, is to pass massive tax breaks for billionaires and wealthy corporations. And then they want working families and middle-class folks and the poor, the sick, and the afflicted to pay for it, saddle us with trillions of dollars of debt, and at the same time, cut things like Medicaid or nutritional assistance for children and families and veterans benefits. We're not going to tolerate it. The votes will not be there for this type of scheme on the Democratic side. And we believe that we're going to have to take this fight to the public domain, make sure we can win the battle for public sentiment. And the reality is, if we're successful in that endeavor, then I don't believe with their narrow Republican margin, they can pass anything close to what is being discussed by the Speaker or by House Republicans.
I mean, on the upside, Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, Mark Zuckerberg, personally and their companies would probably pay a lot less in taxes. So there's always that on the other side of the ledger. I want to ask you about relief for the folks in California. Obviously, Governor Newsom saying, and I think this is proved to be true, this is likely to be the most expensive natural disaster, climate disaster in the history of the country. I've already seen multiple Republicans, both in the Senate and the House, say, well, we got to see what we're going to get back from these Californians. Well, we're going to put some strings attached. We're going to tell California how California should govern itself, because we don't like the way California does it. Of course, nothing like that for the folks in North Carolina or in the Southeast who were hit by disasters earlier this year. Nothing like that in Texas after the freeze, as there should be, right? You should get relief. What is your position and the caucus's position on strings attached to disaster relief to California?
We had a discussion about this today in the House Democratic Caucus, and the consensus position, I think it's fair to say, is that we do not support conditioning any aid to everyday Americans whose lives have been wiped out as a result of extreme weather events, and in this case, in California, by these raging wildfires. Homes have been destroyed, schools have been destroyed, small businesses have been destroyed, churches and synagogues and mosques have been destroyed or are in harm's way. And it is unconscionable that Republicans are suggesting imposing right-wing partisan conditions in order for California taxpayers to receive their tax dollars. California is one of those states, in fact, that sends about 5 times as much to the federal government every year than they get back in return. And so we've got to be there for the people of California. We will be there for the people of California, just as we have been for others across the country.
That is the social contract, in my view. Senator Tommy Tuberville of Alabama should look up that ratio for his state. It might be interesting. House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries, thank you very much.
Joining us now, Democratic strategist and author of the Salty Politics newsletter on Substack, Julie Roginski. She worked with Hegseth at Fox News, and along with former Fox News anchor Gretchen Carlson, wrote a letter to the Armed Services Committee to share their perspectives as survivors of sexual misconduct at Fox News. Also with us, Iraq veteran Army captain and CEO of Iraq and Afghanistan Veterans of America, Allison Jaslow, and staff writer with The Atlantic, Tom Nichols. Allison, I do want to begin with you. In watching the hearing today, we saw the allegations, we saw the controversies, we saw how Democrats pushed him to get answers, how Republicans warmed up to him. I want to know from his testimony specifically how you think the Pentagon would change under Pete Hegseth.
Well, you know, I think it remains to be seen how the Pentagon would be reshaped under his leadership. I hope we actually don't get to that point, even if people are beginning to accept the fact that he might actually be confirmed. And I think as it relates to today's hearing, like, the most concerning thing for me was that senators didn't dig into the fact that he openly lobbied for war criminals to be convicted war criminals, to be pardoned. These were men who had men that were serving alongside of them speak up because though they experienced the same horrors of war, they thought that they crossed lines that we should not cross. And to me, that is the most concerning thing about Pete Hegseth's background, in addition to his comments saying that he thinks that we should not adhere to the Geneva Conventions anymore. And I think it was a real shame that senators didn't dig into that more, because to me, it's the most disqualifying part of his background. And I hope... Sorry.
And no, I think that's exactly what I wanted to get to, the Geneva Conventions. He was asked whether he'd adhere to them, and he was really squishy on that answer. He's been squishy in other publications about the Geneva Conventions. Donald Trump, I asked him personally about the Geneva Conventions back in 2016, and he wouldn't confirm that he wanted to follow the Geneva Conventions. What would it mean, just put into layman's terms, for the U.S. military to throw away the Geneva Conventions, the rules of war?
I mean, it's basically the compact that we've entered into with other nations, that even if we go to war against each other, that there will be certain basic rules, you know, that we will have rules of engagement, that we won't indiscriminately shoot people on the battlefield, especially on the asymmetrical battlefields that Pete Hegseth did talk about as a part of his hearing and many of the interviews that he's done up until this point. And you're speaking to somebody right now who lost a fellow platoon leader. I wear a bracelet with his name on my wrist every day. We lost him while he was following the rules of engagement. But he couldn't tell the difference between the bad guys and the good guys, like many of us couldn't on the battlefield. But it doesn't mean that we still shouldn't have standards that we hold ourselves to. And it's really hard to suffer loss under those circumstances. But the U.S. military holds ourselves to a higher standard for a reason. And it has everything to do with the implications, not only for our national security, but we don't want our men and women in uniform who are fighting for us to be more vulnerable than they already are on the battlefield. And that's what it comes down to.
Tom, in your career, you focused on national affairs, national security issues. You were a professor at the Naval College. Tell me how Pete Hegseth's testimony to you suggested the Pentagon might change.
A couple of things. First of all, Pete Hegseth, in some of the more pointed questioning about his qualifications, Pete Hegseth made it clear that he would have no idea what he's doing as Secretary of Defense, which means one thing you would expect to see in a Pete Hegseth-run Defense Department is that a whole bunch of people undersecretaries, assistant secretaries, the deputy secretary, all these other people would basically be running the Pentagon without very much guidance, because as far as Pete Hegseth's concerned, DEI programs are the enemy and everything else. There wasn't much substance here to find out what he actually would care about in the rest of his management of the Defense Department. So one thing you'd have is a lot of chaos, because when you have a weak, unqualified Secretary of Defense, the Pentagon and the Defense Department's huge. It's several fiefdoms, and it's like it's 3 million people, all of whom are in different departments within that department. And he would spend his time going on TV and doing what he did today at this hearing, railing and giving these little mini Fox speeches about, the war fighters and lethality and woke weakness and all that stuff, while other people would run the place. One thing I want to raise about this, about even suggesting that the United States wouldn't follow the Geneva Conventions, and I think Allison's point is exactly right. That's not who we are. That's not the kind of military we are. It's not the kind of country we are. But there's a very practical point. Once you say that, other nations will say, great, we don't have to follow them either. We'll just, we'll treat your prisoners we'll just execute them if we want. We can torture your guys. We can do all kinds of bad things, as has happened in the past. But the right answer to that is not to say, well, war is different now, so let's just trash all these rules. There was a lot of that macho posturing, and I think that's what you'd see in a Hegseth Pentagon. A lot of these kinds of statements about, well, we're too tough to follow the Geneva Conventions, and we don't have any of this wokeness. I think it would be, I think you got a glimpse today of what it would look like, and it would be a mess.
I feel like we got a little bit of color from Hegseth on some cultural things at the Pentagon, but also on changes in posture. And if you couple that with Donald Trump's own positions that he's held in the past, I think we could see some changes. We're talking about the Geneva Conventions, yes. NATO came up today. He was squishy on staying within NATO. Ukraine and Russia came up only because the senator asked him about it. It was not in his opening statement. His opening statement only referenced China in terms of threats. So what might that mean, coupled with Donald Trump's own positioning toward Russia and Ukraine about what Americans would be doing and what sort of support we would be continuing to give to Ukraine. And then also the way that the military interacts with American citizens on American soil. We heard the interaction between Senator Hirono and Hegseth on shooting protesters. Senator Slotkin, brand new senator from Michigan, just won in November, formerly a congresswoman, asked him about that as well and referenced the past Defense Secretary, Mark Esper, who served under Donald Trump, who refused to follow that order. Let's listen.
Your predecessor in a Trump administration, Secretary Esper, was asked and did use uniformed military to clear unarmed protesters. He was given the order to potentially shoot at them. Helos flew low in Washington, D.C. as crowd control. He later apologized publicly for those actions. Was he right or wrong to apologize?
Senator, I was there on the ground.
And
I saw
I understand, and I respect that.
I've been there.
But you're about to be the Secretary of Defense.
That was involved in that moment. I
was he right to? So he was
legality and the Constitution.
Sir, was he right or wrong to apologize?
I'm not going to put words in the mouth of Secretary Esper or anybody else.
He said them himself. You don't have to. What are you scared of? Did he do the right thing by apologizing?
I'm not scared of anything, Senator.
Then say yes or no. You can say no.
Tom, what did you think of that line of questioning?
I think it shows, again, how completely unprepared he is to assume this awesome responsibility. I mean, this is a question he should have seen coming. But the problem for the nominee and for the Republican senators on that committee is nobody wants to get sideways with Donald Trump and say something that's going to get them a tongue lashing on Truth Social or back in Mar-a-Lago. These should not be hard questions for a future Secretary of Defense. No, I would not follow an illegal order to open fire on unarmed protesters. Yes, I thought Secretary Esper did the right thing. Or, as Senator Slotkin said, or say no. No, I think it was a bad idea for Esper to apologize. The problem is, he just needs to kind of get through this, and I think that's what you saw. There's kind of playing defense. Just get through it, get 51 senators, and then go occupy, the E-ring as long as until the day Donald Trump fires you by tweet.
Senate confirmation hearings for President-elect Donald Trump's cabinet, which begin this morning with one of his most controversial selections, Pete Hegseth, Trump's pick for Secretary of Defense. Members of the Senate Armed Services Committee huddled for a briefing on the FBI background check into Hegseth yesterday. Now, as is customary, only the heads of the committee, Republican Chair Roger Wicker and Ranking Member Jack Reed, were given physical access to the full FBI report. They then were responsible for relaying those findings to all other committee members. This, as NBC News reports, the contents of the report may be lacking. The FBI's security check of Hegseth does not include interviews with any of his ex-wives or the woman who accused him of sexual assault in 2017. That's according to three sources with direct knowledge of the background check. Hegseth was denied any wrongdoing in that case, and the local district attorney declined to file charges, saying there was no proof beyond a reasonable doubt the assault took place. Democratic lawmakers are sounding the alarm that there may be additional key information left out of the report.
I only know that some of the folks that have, the women in his past women in his life have wanted to be interviewed but have not been interviewed by the vetters.
The transition team has slow-walked and stonewalled us, but we do know that there are significant gaps in that background check. It's incomplete and, so far as we know, inadequate. And I am deeply concerned that there are facts that so far have been hidden from this committee. What are they hiding that they won't give us this kind of information?
Meanwhile, the New York Times reports that investigators reached out to Pete Hegseth's second ex-wife, Samantha Hegseth. The couple were married from 2010 until 2018, and according to the Times, FBI investigators had an initial perfunctory conversation with her on January 8th, according to people familiar with the apprised of the report. Ms. Hegseth then made multiple attempts to contact the Bureau for a more substantive discussion, but her calls were not returned last week, said those with knowledge of the investigation who were not authorized to speak publicly on the matter. Let's bring in the host of Way Too Early, Ali Vitale, and Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist and associate editor of The Washington Post, Eugene Robinson.
Thank you all for being with us. Let's start. John Lemire, let me ask you, what is the reaction, and I guess, to this very incomplete FBI report, but also, more importantly, a lot of people asking, how do you have an FBI report on Pete Hegseth when those with the most explosive charges aren't even a part of that FBI report, and you have one person trying to contact the FBI repeatedly who doesn't get her calls returned?
Yeah, the report seems extraordinarily incomplete, and we just heard a little bit of real Democratic outrage yesterday about that fact. Let's recall, of course, that the Trump team initially for weeks stonewalled the idea of any background checks, certainly by the FBI, as the president-elect began selecting his possible cabinet members. They wanted to do the background checks through a private company. There were real concerns there that wouldn't be complete. They eventually let the FBI take part, but it seems here not able to talk to every pertinent person, including these ex-wives and those who suggested Hegseth behaved inappropriately with them. So I think right from the get-go in this hearing today, slated for this morning, the first of a series of high-profile and some incendiary hearings, we're going to hear from Democrats crying foul on this very process. Now, Pete Hegseth himself, his testimony, prepared testimony, leaked to Axios, other places. We know he's going to say it's time for someone who served in combat. He is a veteran to lead the department, to lead the Pentagon. He's going to talk about his mistakes in his life. He says he's found God. His new wife has changed his behavior. We know in the confirmation interviews with senators, he said he'd stop drinking and the like. But there are real questions here he's going to have to face, and some pointed questions from Democrats about his personal conduct as well as his qualifications. And few suggest that this Fox News contributor would have the bona fides to lead this department. We will see where this goes. Whip count, Republicans are growing more and more confident they have the votes, but no one knows for sure as to where this goes next. And there are a few eyes, certainly Joni Ernst, a couple other Republicans seen as the key votes here. And I think a lot of people say it's still up in the air. Well, it depends what happens today at the hearing.
Well, yeah, and Ali, please feel free to give us more insight on what you're hearing on the Hill. But again, the question that's raised here is, who directed the FBI not to talk to the person with the most explosive testimony against Pete Hegseth, charges of rape against Pete Hegseth? The police, again, we've said the police did not press the charges. But the fact that you don't have this woman that has come forward with all of this information about that California event, and then again, one of his ex-wives trying to reach the FBI and not getting return calls. So, is there any suggestion that that the Trump transition team directed the FBI to what it could or could not investigate, or would that be the Republicans in the Senate that would tell the FBI don't talk to the people that may have the most germane evidence against Pete Hegseth?
Well, we don't know at this point if that direction was given, but it's important to remember that, as one of our reporters who's been covering this said to me yesterday on Way Too Early, the client for the people doing the investigation is not Congress. The job is not to give Congress the most information possible. The job is to do the investigating at the direction of the client, in this case, the Trump transition team. And so that's going to be important for us to keep in mind when we watch Democrats talk about the gaps in this report. And I think we're right to lay out how glaring they absolutely are. And it's something that Democrats are now going to use in their lines of questioning. They were already going to talk about the sexual assault allegation. They were already going to talk about the potential themes around his ex-wives. But now we're going to see them not just talk about that, but also ask the question of why this wouldn't have been included in the kind of report that senators have gotten quite used to getting. Even if they're not reading the report itself, being briefed in full on what's in the report. And it's clear these are the rules of this committee. That's not the thing that's odd here. The thing that's odd here is that there are pieces of this report that seem very obvious to have investigators at least ask questions about and bring back to Congress. And that wasn't done here. And that's just the gaps in the report on the sexual violence and sexual assault allegation, and also things that his ex-wives might have said. But then there's also the misuse of funds at veterans organizations. There are the allegations that NBC News has reported on that he was abusing alcohol. All of that is going to be in this hearing that is going to be quite explosive on Capitol Hill.
Gene, this is an extraordinary moment in terms of Senate hearings, I would imagine. There is no director of the FBI. Chris Wright has resigned. There's an acting director. We don't know what the FBI is doing in terms of pursuing any extraordinary or extra questioning of potential witnesses, people who are willing to give testimony about Pete Hegseth. But we do know that the post is not like the Postmaster General. It's the Secretary of Defense. In a very dangerous world. And on paper, and according to everything you hear from, including some Republicans, Pete Hegseth is extraordinarily unqualified. So where does the Senate committee go from here with not as much information as they need and not as much cooperation, perhaps, from the Federal Bureau of Investigation?
Well, that's a very good question, because the hearing is today, right? So they're supposed to have the information. The committee chairman and the ranking member have already looked at the background reports. They're ready to go, and so it's really frustrating to have to talk about this investigation in retrospect. But that's kind of where we are now, unless something extraordinary happens, and there's some attempt to sort of go back into this. Look, Merrick Garland is still the Attorney General, right? I mean, and Joe Biden is still the president. It's not as if the transition has already happened. So I am really curious as to why, with a job this important, it's not just these allegations against Hegseth. It's the whole question of whether he is remotely capable of doing what is really one of the most important jobs in our government, a job that's doubly important now because there are all these questions about the readiness of the U.S. Defense Department if Paris thought we ever had to fight or deter a major war. And, these are big questions about what we're doing militarily to counter the rise of China. Is Pete Hegseth the guy to figure that out? And I want to know more about that.
Well, I've got to say, again, all the character issues aside, I can tell you there's not a single person in Washington, D.C. that I've talked to that thinks that he's qualified to run the Pentagon. Again, all character questions aside, that's something that Joni Ernst knows. She knows he's not qualified to run the Pentagon. That's something that John Thune knows. He knows Pete Hegseth is not qualified to run the Pentagon. That's something Mitch McConnell knows. That's something that Lisa Murkowski knows. That's something that Susan Collin knows. It's something, of course, that Todd Young, one of the most serious thinkers on national defense issues, knows. So, again, all of these character questions aside, these so-called John Tower questions, all of those aside, everybody knows the underlying truth that nobody will be served. I mean, the DOD will not be served by this. Americans will not be served by it. The armed forces won't be served by it. Even the commander-in-chief, Donald Trump, ultimately will not be served by having somebody running the DOD that's ill-equipped just because of experience or lack thereof of running the DOD. Still, the question this morning regarding the start of this hearing, Jonathan Lemire, has to go back to why didn't the FBI ask the most basic questions from the most germane witnesses? Were they instructed not to by somebody, or do you think they were doing it because they didn't want to offend the incoming administration?
That is a great question. Now, to Ali's point, the parameters are usually set by the transition team. And that would be the case here as well. So there's likely, some of this at least, is instructions from the Trump team. The specifics we don't know. We're still reporting. The New York Times has broke this story, pieces of the story last night. They don't have either. There is a suggestion. We know Tammy Duckworth. We played a little bit of sound from her a few moments ago, the senator from Illinois. I was just reading further from what she had to say yesterday. She also wondered that in some cases, the women involved may not have wanted to come forward because they were fearful of their safety or safety of their children. So I think that's an element here. But we know that's not the case, at least, for the one ex-wife who proactively reached out to the FBI. So why she was rebuffed, why she was ignored, that will be one of the mysteries that I think, we heard this from Senator Blumenthal as well. I was just reading his notes, that we'll probably hear in the first minutes of the hearing today. Why did it happen this way?